Welcome back to another episode of Written for Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We are picking up with a new subtopic today, talking about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It's going to take us quite a while to get through because there's a lot of ground to cover, but we want to understand right off the bat that the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, it's like the prophets in that it takes up about a third of the content of the Old Testament. And what that basically translates to is that you're talking about books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon that are all included in this category of what we would call the wisdom books, or what you'll see referred to as the wisdom literature. And really, all that's saying about these books is that they share in common this theme of talking in detail about what it means to live wisely before God. They talk about things that are difficult to describe in other ways that are not straightforward topics. Like, for example, in the book of Job, you're dealing with the problem of suffering there. So a book like that is written not in a straightforward way that you might expect, but it's rather written in poetry, just as you'll find in Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And that poetry is written for purpose. So understand that when we talk about poetry, to us reading it now, because obviously Hebrew poetry is very different than English poetry, but when you read Hebrew poetry, it has a certain rhythm to it and a certain eloquence to it, and that makes it memorable to the reader. And when you're dealing with a society that their communication was basically verbal, where they would communicate these things like reading from Psalms or Proverbs, and that's how people were receiving knowledge because they didn't have the ability to read it in many cases, it makes it very important to make sure that what you say has impact and that it's something that people can easily recall. And that's precisely where a book like Psalms or Proverbs really comes in handy because of how easy it is to memorize those things just by hearing them based upon the meter and the rhythm that they have built within them. Now, our focus is going to be mostly on Proverbs and Psalms. And of course, we're going to begin with Proverbs because there's a lot of detail in Proverbs that has a lot of relevance even to this day. So people are still to this day referring to Proverbs for advice and counsel on a variety of issues. Proverbs deals with just about every topic you could imagine. It deals with relationships within the family, the husband, the wife, the children, all these different relationships. It deals with friendship. It deals with the way we use our words. It deals with a lot of things that are very important and relevant for all people for all time. And so we especially want to focus on that and understand some of the common topics and thoughts that arise in Proverbs and really see how that comes into play now. But we really want to focus on this detail to start us off in Proverbs as we dive into this study. And that's the fact that wisdom begins with the fear of God. Now, as this title of the lesson is, we're talking about the keys to righteous living, which we'll get to in just a moment. But the fear of God is the foundation for all of this. Apart from the fear of God, you're not going to be able to live righteously nor understand wisdom to the fullest extent. I want to actually read that section of scripture that I have on the screen there, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. This obviously is the introduction to this book. And I want us to read this and really think about the fear of the Lord and what that means in Proverbs. And we'll talk about that in some detail and see how that becomes the foundation for everything else that it says in this book. So join me here in Proverbs chapter 1. I'm reading verses 1 through 7, and we'll understand what we're talking about when we say the fear of God is the foundation for all wisdom. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. I would advise you when you're reading through the Proverbs especially here to really take note of what's being said here. This is very significant. So right out of the gate, Solomon is telling us what his intention is. He's using these Proverbs to impart wisdom and instruction. He's giving these things to help people to live better lives, to understand how life operates and what really leads to good outcomes. And specifically, verse 7, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is the foundation for all of this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, is what verse 7 begins saying. And that is going to be a recurring theme throughout Proverbs. You'll find that statement repeated in different ways throughout the book. You'll see it referred to in different ways throughout the book. So that becomes, again, the foundation for all that comes after it. So pay careful attention to that and understand that we're talking about the fear of the Lord being the important thing to understand. Now, to that point about what fear means in this particular passage, this is where we can sometimes get a little bit off track with what we're talking about. Because there's a different type of fear that comes up here in the fact that we talk about fear in terms of it paralyzing us or causing us to be afraid. That's not per se the fear that's in view. It's not totally out of view, but it's certainly not the focus here in this passage. Because the fear and consideration here is the idea of reverence, or maybe we would call that respect toward God. Now, obviously, that's based upon the fact that he is greater than we are. He is one to be feared in the sense of actual being afraid. But the main thing is to revere him, to respect him and what he says, and to revere and respect him above everything and everyone else, to realize that he truly is the source of all things, including knowledge and wisdom. So that is why we say this is the foundation where everything begins, and nothing is going to really make sense unless we understand this point made in verse 7. Now, going a little bit forward here, we realize that's the beginning of this conversation when we talk about wisdom and what it means to live righteously or to really even begin to understand wisdom. But as we go throughout the body of Proverbs, especially those early chapters, we see more of this come to light about what it means to live righteously and the factors that really help us to live the right kind of life. And that again goes back to why this is so relevant and important, because when you read through Proverbs, again, this is Old Testament, but that doesn't mean it has no value. In fact, it has exceedingly good value to us even now, precisely why we're having this study. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk about the first key to righteous living, which is going to be to heed wisdom's call. This is going to take us back to Proverbs chapter 1, verses 20 through 33, so rounding out the chapter there. And in this particular passage, we're talking about the idea of wisdom being portrayed as a person. And this particular person, personified as wisdom, is going to be calling out for people to listen to what wisdom has to say. So let's go over to Proverbs chapter 1 again. And let's take a look here at Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 20 and just read through to the end of the chapter. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses. At the openings of the gates in the city, she speaks her words. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel, and would have none of my rebuke. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm, and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge, and did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel, and despise my every rebuke. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way, and be filled to the full with their own fancies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely, and will be secure, without fear of evil. Now there's a lot of detail there, and reading through that might be a little confusing at first. But again, remember what's taking place here and what Solomon is trying to do. He's seeing wisdom as a person. Obviously, he's speaking not of literal things, but of just a concept, an idea. It's very common in philosophy to do something like this. But he's seeing wisdom as a person who is out there calling to people to listen to what she has to say. And also talking about the dangers of not listening and the problems that will enter someone's life if they refuse to heed what wisdom tells them. But also the blessings of listening to wisdom are also talked about there toward the end of the chapter. Notice verse 33. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. Now, Proverbs is going to be very general in a lot of its advice, so we want to be careful to understand that it's not saying in a passage like that or other passages that might have similar language that if you do these things, boom, everything's going to work out for you. That's not per se Solomon's purpose. But as a general rule, the Proverbs do teach a better way of life that will show people how to live properly, how to avoid common problems, these types of ideas. So I want to keep that in mind as we go through this. So going back to our slideshow here, we find the reality that we want to heed wisdom's call once again. And really we're talking about listening to what wisdom says. So we want to make sure that as we go through Proverbs, that we're paying attention and listening to what the Proverbs have to say to us. It's very easy to listen and we hear the words. We understand the words, but to actually take heed to them is a different situation altogether. This is something we deal with quite commonly just in general life. It's one thing to hear what someone says, but to actually hear it in the sense of understanding it and doing something about it, that can be quite different. So we can have the fear of the Lord that we already talked about in the earlier part of chapter 1, but we've got to tack onto that this willingness to listen and change in response to what we have heard from wisdom. So it's a call for us to overhaul our lives, to think differently about things or to act differently in a variety of situations. and want to make sure we lay hold of the blessings that wisdom can give and not fall prey to the terrors and the problems that it mentions in that passage that we just read. So we've got to first and foremost, beyond the fear of the Lord, make sure that we take heed to the wisdom that God has revealed to us through a book like Proverbs. There's another key to righteous living, and that's the fact that we want to seek wisdom out. So obviously, we want to fear God, we want to make sure we listen to God and the wisdom he gives, but we also want to seek that out. Join me again in reading here in Proverbs chapter 2. I'm reading the first 5 verses of that chapter. So here we are in Proverbs chapter 2. Let's just read the first 5 verses here of what this chapter says. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So again, a lot of language there that at first glance might be a little confusing to us, but the basic message is to treasure wisdom and to seek out what wisdom has to say, which draws us to a book like Proverbs. So here wisdom is not only portrayed as a person, but also as a prized treasure, something you can lay hold of, something that is to be highly esteemed in our minds, much like you would esteem gold or silver. We want to make sure wisdom is viewed that same way or higher than those physical material possessions. So we want to make sure that we're pursuing that and seeking it out in the same way we would seek out earthly treasure. So in addition to fearing God and listening to what he says, there's also got to be a diligent search too. Because while those things are important, exceedingly important, there has to be a diligent effort on our part to seek these things out with the recognition that we don't have it all figured out, that there's still more to learn, there's still more for us to unveil and to understand, and we do that through a diligent search for God's wisdom revealed to us in a book like Proverbs. So we're being called and told here that we want to make sure that we're seeking out that wisdom, that we're making it part of our lives to pursue this, and to not be lazy about it, to not just do it casually, but to make it something that is an urgent priority for us, understanding the benefits that come. Because once again, as that text mentioned there in verses 4 and 5, that if we do this diligent search, we will understand the fear of the Lord and will find the knowledge of God, telling us that we're going to understand things that otherwise, because of our laziness or our casual attitude, we never would come to the understanding of. So if we want to live righteously, we've got to diligently seek God's wisdom. Let's consider this third and final key we're going to talk about today. And that's going to be the fact that we have to put our trust in God. Now, this one might sound obvious. I suppose in a sense all of these might sound somewhat obvious, but we want to understand that Proverbs is communicating a specific message to us about what we need to be doing. So we've seen up to this point the fear of the Lord. That's where it all starts. We've talked about how we need to listen to wisdom. We just talked about how we need to seek wisdom out. But to tie all that together, we've got to put our trust in God. This passage is something that might be already familiar to you, but we're going to read it anyway. It's in Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5 and reading down to verse 8. So here's Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5 and reading to verse 8. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Again, a very beautiful passage. At first glance, might be a little bit tricky to understand everything that's being said there. But again, let's just make it simple. It's telling us to put our trust in God and not trust in ourselves. To not let our own wisdom be what guides the way that we live. To not let our own ideas or philosophies be something that we use to go throughout our lives. But to rather look to God for those things and let him be the one that guides us through the different situations in which we find ourselves. And there's that specific call in verse 7 to not be wise in our own eyes because, as Proverbs will talk about in several other places, to be wise in one's own eyes is actually foolishness, despite the fact that you might imply that wisdom there would mean that you are wise, but that's actually not the case. Because true wisdom is the acknowledgement that you are not the source of wisdom, but God is. And you're going to look to what he says rather than what you would think or what you believe to actually be wise. So having said all that, trust in God becomes a major factor if we want to live righteously and actually understand what wisdom means. So we have to put our trust in him. We have to lay aside our own ideas and our own beliefs and all these different things that have been handed down to us or that we have cultivated over time, and instead just put our trust simply in God and in what he tells us. And as we go through Proverbs that talk about how we speak or how we live or these different relationships, we want to understand that we might come across various things that sound good, and they might even come from reputable people. But we have to understand that if they go against the wisdom God has given us, then that might cause us to pause. We have to really consider, is this truly wisdom, or is this wisdom that is not really wisdom? It's something that looks the part but actually is not the part. Because again, if all wisdom comes from God, if he is the source of these things, if he's teaching us these things, we want to make sure that we're using that and not putting our trust in other things. So we fear God. That's the beginning of all of this. We revere him, we respect him, we honor him in that way. We heed what he says in his wisdom. We diligently seek his ways, but we've got to trust him above all else. To really look to him as the source and provider of all that we need, including wisdom. And to not look to ourselves any longer for the things that will guide us through this life, but to instead look to him, knowing that he has the answers. He has the solutions. He has a better way that will help us to truly be all that he wants us to be. So there's so much more we have to say about Proverbs. But hopefully this has introduced the thought to us about what Proverbs teaches us, the idea of the wisdom books in general. And we have a lot more we're going to talk about as we go through this, and the, again, overall topics that Proverbs brings up and the importance that they still have even to this day. But we're going to pause for right now in this conversation. We'll pick up next week talking about the use of our words in the book of Proverbs, and I hope you'll be looking forward to that. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this, and I hope it's been a benefit to you. Thank you.